On a gray afternoon in Manhattan, the last visitors from Catherine Quay's funeral dispersed, leaving Sophie alone in front of the elegant family mausoleum. Wrapped in a black coat that barely shielded her from the cold autumn wind, she stared at the engraved letters on the stone with a mix of sadness and disbelief. Catherine, an iconic figure of New York high society, had left a void that no fortune could fill. Sophie's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Reynolds, the family lawyer, who brought with him heavy envelopes and a solemn expression. He approached, offering his condolences before getting to the reason for his visit. "Sophie, your mother left clear instructions in her will," began Mr. Reynolds, adjusting his glasses. "You are now the primary heir to her fortune, including the apartment on Park Avenue, as well as various other properties and investments." Sophie absorbed the words slowly. I wasn't expecting this. I always thought there would be a trust fund or something that would be managed. Until I was ready," she murmured, her voice trembling as she traced the shock and sudden responsibility that had fallen on her shoulders. "I understand your concerns, but your mother had full confidence in your ability to manage the estate. She mentioned this several times," Mr. Reynolds reassured her, handing her the documents. "She also left a letter for you. I believe you will find some answers there." With trembling hands, Sophie opened the sealed envelope, finding a letter written in her mother's elegant handwriting. The words were affectionate and encouraging, describing her unwavering faith in Sophie's strength and discernment. "You have always been the light of my life, and your heart has always known what is right. I entrust this legacy to you, not just as a proof of my love, but as a symbol of my belief in your ability to expand our story and help those in need." Tears silently ran down Sophie's face as she folded the letter, feeling a mix of honor and immense weight. Looking back at Mr. Reynolds, she asked, "And now? What should I do? I feel like I'm about to sink with all this." "Your mother hired a team of managers and consultants who can assist you. And, of course, I am at your disposal to help at every step of the way. The most important thing now is that you take your time to adapt," advised the lawyer. "I just hope I'm up to the expectations," Sophie whispered, more to herself than to her legal advisor. She looked at the bare trees around her, their leaves already fallen, heralding the approaching winter. It was a new season in her life, and with it came the challenge of preserving her mother's legacy and forging her own path. As she left the cemetery, the image of the luxurious apartment on Park Avenue came to mind. She had never felt completely at ease in that vast, decorated space, even when her mother was alive. Now it was hers by right, a stage for a life she needed to redefine. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling determined to face the challenges ahead. She knew the next few weeks would be a whirlwind of decisions and discoveries. But, for now, she needed a moment to herself, a moment to begin understanding the vastness of what she had inherited. The roar of the engines diminished as the plane touched down at JFK Airport, marking Jack Zimmerman's return to New York. The news of his mother's inheritance had reached him even on the distant beaches of Thailand, abruptly interrupting his spiritual quest and bringing him back to the reality of family obligations. As he hurriedly walked through the airport corridor, his thoughts oscillated between concern and caution. Passing through customs, a familiar face awaited him beyond the security area. Shirley, clad in her typical Chanel suit and wearing an inscrutable expression, waved lightly. Jack adjusted his backpack strap and approached, trying to read the intentions behind his older sister's polished smile. "Jack, finally! How was your trip?" Shirley asked, extending a cool, controlled hand. "As long as a day without coffee," Jack replied, forcing a half-smile as he took her hand. "How's Sophie? And the whole situation with the inheritance?" Shirley let out a dramatic sigh, leading him out of the terminal. "Let's talk in the car, it's more comfortable." She signaled to a driver who promptly opened the rear door of a black sedan. Once settled in the vehicle, Shirley wasted no time. "Sophie is overwhelmed, I would say. Our mother left everything to her, as you must know, and there are many interested parties." Jack looked at her, frowning. "Interested parties?" Shirley, I hope you're taking care of her, not leaving vultures around. Shirley laughed, a somewhat forced sound. Oh, Jack, always the protector. But, see, I'm doing what I can. However, you know Sophie, always wanting to do things her own way. She can be a bit naive. And what about Richard Fuller? Jack asked, his eyes fixed on Shirley's. I hear he's very interested in the situation. I hope you're not thinking of pushing Sophie into something just for convenience or financial benefit. Shirley adjusted her pearl necklace, her gaze briefly diverting. Richard is an influential man, and his alliance could be beneficial for all of us, Jack. It's not just about money, but about maintaining our social position and influence. Jack pursed his lips, displeased with the response. I just want Sophie's decision to be respected, Shirley. She's not a pawn in a social chess game. Of course, Shirley agreed quickly, though her voice carried a tone of forced patience. We'll ensure that Sophie has space to make her own decisions. I'm just facilitating things. The car glided through the busy streets of New York, and Jack felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew the coming days would be crucial in defining Sophie's future and their mother's legacy. He needed to be there for Sophie, now more than ever. As they arrived at the luxurious building where Sophie resided, Jack braced himself for the encounter with his younger sister. He had many questions and concerns, but above all, he was determined to ensure that she felt supported and protected. He knew the real challenge was just beginning. In Sophie's spacious apartment, walls adorned with modern art witnessed a new tumultuous chapter in the heiress's life. Shirley, with almost theatrical skill, began to weave her web of influence more tightly around Sophie, who, still vulnerable from mourning, found herself increasingly reliant on her older sister's advice. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, as they watched the city through the panoramic windows of the living room, Shirley spoke to Sophie about the next steps necessary to secure the future. Sophie, dear, you know how important it is to establish strong alliances, especially now, Shirley began, serving tea in fine porcelain cups. Richard Fuller is a man of respect and influence, and he is very interested in helping you manage your inheritance. Sophie, holding the cup with both hands, appeared uncertain. But Shirley, I barely know Richard. And all this, it seems so calculated. That's how the world works, dear. And Richard is not just anyone. He can offer you more than financial stability. He can protect our name and legacy, Shirley explained, her voice persuasively gentle. Jack, who had just arrived at the apartment and was listening to the conversation from outside the room, felt a pang in his heart. He knew all too well Shirley's cunning in manipulating situations to her favor. Entering discreetly, he decided to intervene. Shirley, don't you think Sophie needs time to think about all this? We can't rush such important decisions, said Jack, approaching the two. Shirley smiled at Jack, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Jack, dear, of course I agree. But we also can't ignore opportunities when they present themselves. Richard will be at our charity reception this weekend, and it would be a good time for Sophie to get to know him better. Jack exchanged a worried look with Sophie, who seemed increasingly confused and overwhelmed. I just want what's best for us, for our family, Sophie murmured, more to herself than to the others present. As the days approached the charity event, Shirley intensified her efforts. She arranged casual meetings between Sophie and Richard, manipulating each conversation to highlight Richard's qualities and influence. At each meeting, Richard displayed a studied charm, always talking about business, art, and philanthropy, themes he knew were of interest to Sophie. Jack, closely observing everything, began to gather information about Richard. He did not trust the magnate's intentions and feared his sister was being pushed into a trap disguised as a fairy tale. His suspicions only grew as he noticed how frequently Shirley and Richard exchanged knowing looks and whispered comments. One evening, after another arranged meeting, Jack confronted Sophie in her art studio, where she sought refuge among her brushes and canvases. Sophie, are you happy with the direction things are taking? Do you really think Richard is the right person for? Jack began, choosing his words carefully. Sophie put down her brush and sighed. I don't know, Jack. Sometimes, I feel like I'm being swept along by the current, not knowing how to swim. Shirley seems so sure of everything. Jack approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. I'm here, and we'll figure this out together, okay? We won't let anyone decide your future for you. Jack's words brought a glimpse of relief to Sophie's face, but the shadow of Shirley's manipulations still hung over them. With the charity reception approaching, Jack knew he needed to act fast. It was time to unravel Shirley and Richard's true plans before it was too late. As New York City plunged into the darkness of another cold night, the soft light of a lamp discreetly illuminated a secluded room in Le Chateau restaurant, a haunt known for its confidential meetings among the city's elite. Richard Fuller and Shirley Quay occupied a distant table, away from the curious gazes of other patrons. A bottle of red wine, almost untouched, rested between them, symbolizing less a toast and more an accessory to the theater of manipulations they were involved in. We're almost there, Richard. Sophie is becoming increasingly receptive to the guidance you offer, Shirley said, her voice low with a barely disguised tone of triumph. Richard, whose calculating eyes rarely lost focus, nodded in satisfaction. She is young and, from what I've seen, quite impressionable. It's essential that we continue to press, but with subtlety. We don't want her to start suspecting our true intentions. Of course, but what about her brother, Jack? He doesn't seem so willing to accept things as they are. I suspect he might be a problem, Shirley pondered, intertwining her fingers, a gesture that denoted both nervousness and calculation. Leave Jack to me. I have some trump cards I can use to ensure his cooperation, or at least his inactivity. It's nothing we can't handle, Richard responded, with confidence that seemed to spring from past experiences in dealing with human obstacles. Shirley smiled, a smile that had little joy and much strategy. And what about the documents we need to adjust? Are the lawyers ready to make the necessary changes so that the inheritance transfer goes smoothly as soon as we get married? Yes, I have them under control. They know their compensation depends on the success of this arrangement. There will be no mistakes, Richard assured her, taking a sip of his wine with the calm of someone who plays a game already won. And our little incentives for the board members? Are they all in line with the plan? Shirley inquired, referring to the carefully distributed bribes to ensure loyalty where persuasion failed. Everyone is on board, dear Shirley. After all, no one wants to miss the chance to be part of one of New York's greatest financial empires, Richard remarked, with a predatory gleam in his eyes. With their plans outlined and the pieces of their chess game precisely positioned, they both stood up. They exchanged a firm handshake, more promising of conspiracies than of cordial farewells. Then, until the reception on Saturday. It will be the perfect stage to solidify everything we've planned, Shirley concluded, adjusting her purse over her shoulder. Undoubtedly. Sophie will be the star of the night, and we, the architects of her destiny, Richard declared, with a smile that barely hid his true nature. As Shirley left, Richard remained for a moment longer, contemplating the implications of their plans. He knew that each step needed to be meticulously calculated. After all, the prize was nothing less than total control over the Quay fortune. Meanwhile, in the shadows beginning to thicken around the restaurant, Jack Zimmerman, following his own protective instincts, approached Le Chateau, determined to discover what was really happening. He knew he needed to act fast, as every moment could bring Sophie closer to the danger he so feared. The night had fallen over New York when Jack Zimmerman left Le Chateau, his mind spinning with the words captured from the clandestine meeting between Shirley and Richard. He knew he needed more information to confront them with solid evidence, so his first stop was an old acquaintance, an investigative journalist named Tom, who had a reputation for unraveling the dark secrets of the city's elite. Tom, I need everything you can find out about Richard Fuller. There's something off about him, and my sister is falling into a trap, Jack explained as they sat down in a dimly lit cafe, away from prying ears. Tom, a man with sharp eyes accustomed to reading between the lines, nodded in understanding. Richard Fuller, huh? The real estate magnate? I've heard he's not exactly an open book. Leave it with me, Jack. I'll dig deep. Days later, Tom returned with a dossier. It's not pretty, Jack. Richard has been involved in several questionable operations. Fraud, bribery, even some allegations of extortion. He covers his tracks well, but there are patterns here we can't ignore. Armed with this new information, Jack went to meet Shirley at her apartment, where he found her reviewing some legal documents. The tension was palpable as soon as he entered the room. "Shirley, we need to talk about Richard Fuller," Jack began, his voice firm, cutting through the silence. "I've discovered things about him that you need to know. He's not who he claims to be." Shirley looked up from the papers, her expression a mix of irritation and caution. "Jack, don't be paranoid. Richard is an influential and respected man. What have you discovered?" Jack displayed the dossier. "Illegal activities, Shirley. Fraud, bribery. This is just the tip of the iceberg. How can you ignore this? How can you push Sophie towards someone like that?" With a natural skill for manipulation, Shirley diverted the argument. "Oh, Jack, always so dramatic. In Richard circles, sometimes hands need to get dirty. That doesn't mean he's a bad person, or that he will harm Sophie. That's justifying the unjustifiable, Shirley. Doesn't that concern you?" Jack was increasingly exasperated, feeling like he was talking to a wall. Shirley stood up, approaching Jack with an almost frightening calmness. "What really concerns me is our family and its future. Richard can secure that. Think about what we're protecting here, Jack. Don't let your idealism cost us everything." The discussion between them intensified, each word loaded with years of resentments and conflicting worldviews. Shirley, ever adept, used every tool of persuasion to try to convince Jack that her actions were justified. Frustrated and knowing he could not change Shirley's view at that moment, Jack withdrew. He needed a plan, something that could protect Sophie without relying on Shirley's cooperation. As Jack left the building, the weight of responsibilities seemed to grow. He knew the next step would be crucial, not just to expose Richard, but also to reveal Shirley's true colors to Sophie. It was a battle he had not expected to fight, but he was determined to win. The engagement night of Sophie Quay was meticulously orchestrated to be a spectacular event, reflecting the splendor and wealth associated with the Quay name. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, with its sparkling crystal chandeliers and opulent floral arrangements, was filled with guests from New York's high society. Chamber musicians played soft melodies in the background, while waiters in impeccable attire circulated with trays of champagne and delicate canapes. Sophie, dressed in an elegant white silk gown that gracefully flowed to the floor, appeared a vision of beauty and grace. However, beneath the surface of her polite smile, there was a current of anxiety and uncertainty that only Jack seemed to notice. Richard Fuller, ever the gentleman, stood by Sophie's side, introducing her to guests as his future wife. His smile was charming, but his eyes calculated every interaction, every benefit this union could bring. Shirley, the architect behind this arrangement, watched the scene with almost palpable satisfaction. She approached Sophie and Richard, lightly touching both their shoulders while speaking with an influential guest. "Richard and Sophie are a perfect match, don't you think? We are all very excited about this union," Shirley commented, her voice tinged with a pride that sounded more forced than genuine. Jack, standing near a column, watched the scene with a growing sense of despair. He approached Sophie at a moment when Richard was pulled into a conversation with some investors. "Sophie, are you okay with this? With all of this?" Jack asked quietly, his concern evident in his eyes. Sophie looked at Jack, her eyes briefly reflecting the internal storm she felt. I don't know, Jack. Everything is happening so fast. Shirley says it's for the best, and Richard seems like a good person. You need to be sure, Sophie. Marriage isn't something to enter without certainty, Jack replied, feeling the urgency to protect his sister from the traps that Shirley and Richard were setting. Before Sophie could respond, Richard returned, placing his arm around her with a possessiveness that made Jack shudder. "Come, dear, let's announce our dance," Richard said, leading Sophie to the center of the floor. The music shifted to a slow waltz, and the couple began to dance under the watchful eyes of the guests. Sophie's smile was hesitant, each step a reluctant confirmation of the path she seemed destined to follow. Jack, watching from a distance, felt a mix of anger and helplessness. He knew he needed to act, but how could he expose Richard's true nature and Shirley's plans without causing a scandal that would ruin Sophie's life? As the guests applauded the bride and groom, Jack realized that the next step would be critical. He needed concrete evidence, something he could use to open Sophie's eyes before it was too late. After the engagement ceremony, while the Waldorf Astoria still echoed with the remnants of the celebration, Jack Zimmerman felt that every moment of inaction pushed him into a state of growing despair. Determined to find something that could be used to expose the true intentions of Shirley and Richard, Jack decided to break into the office that Richard frequently used when in town. It was late at night, and the building was quiet, with only the soft sounds of janitors working on the lower floors. Jack, with his hacking skills not entirely forgotten from his university days, managed to access the security system and enter the office undetected. The office was a reflection of Richard himself, meticulously organized, opulent, and imposing. Jack began his search through the desk drawers, quickly sifting through contracts and correspondence. In a locked drawer, he found a collection of documents that looked promising. Using a small set of tools he always carried, he opened the drawer and his eyes quickly scanned several folders marked Quay Estate. Within these folders, Jack discovered a series of documents that were clearly not just regular business contracts. There were copies of wills, including that of Sophie and Jack's mother, and what appeared to be altered versions of these documents. The changes were subtle but significant, altering the distribution of the inheritance in ways that clearly benefited Richard. Even more alarming, Jack found a prenuptial agreement between Sophie and Richard. The document was filled with clauses that disproportionately favored Richard, including severe financial penalties for Sophie should the marriage end. Jack felt a mix of anger and betrayal as he realized the depth of Shirley and Richard's manipulation. He took photos of all the documents with his phone, ensuring he had copies before putting everything back exactly as he found it. With the evidence in hand, he left the building as silently as he had entered, his mind buzzing with the next step. He knew he needed to confront Shirley, but first, he needed to ensure that Sophie understood the situation without being swayed by her sister. The next day, Jack arranged to meet Sophie at a quiet cafe, away from their usual spots and potential eavesdropping by Shirley or Richard. "Sophie, there's something very serious you need to see before making any decisions about your marriage to Richard," Jack began as soon as they sat down at a discreet table in the corner of the cafe. Sophie looked at Jack, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "What's going on, Jack? You're scaring me." Jack showed the photos of the documents to Sophie, explaining each suspicious alteration and clause he had found. "These documents have been modified to benefit Richard, and there's more, much more that's wrong with this arranged marriage." Sophie listened, each word from Jack adding weight to her heart. Tears began to form in her eyes as she absorbed the reality of the betrayal. I can't believe Shirley would do this to me. To us." Jack held Sophie's hand. "I will protect you, Sophie. But we need to act quickly and carefully. Shirley and Richard are dangerous." Determined and with a plan beginning to form, Jack knew the next step would be to confront Shirley directly. He needed to dismantle the farce before it caused further damage. The fight to protect Sophie was just beginning, and he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. After meeting with Sophie, Jack knew that confronting Shirley and Richard would require more than just bravery. It needed a robust plan and reliable allies. Recalling his mother's old friends, people who had gradually distanced themselves after her death, Jack decided to seek support from this forgotten circle. Determined, he began making calls, reactivating contacts he hadn't used for years. His first stop was the home of Martha Greenwald, a close old friend of his mother and a well-known city philanthropist, who always had a sharp perception of people. "Jack, my dear, it's been so long." Martha greeted him warmly in her elegant living room, adorned with period portraits and Victorian furniture. "What brings you here after all this time? I hope it's not just nostalgia." "Martha, I need help," Jack began, his tone serious, cutting through the lightness of the reunion. "It's about Shirley and a man named Richard Fuller. They are trying to manipulate the inheritance my mother left for Sophie." Martha frowned, her face reflecting concern. "I always knew Shirley had a manipulative streak, but this sounds more serious than I expected. Tell me everything." Jack explained the situation, showing the photos of the documents he had found and describing the manipulations and alterations Shirley and Richard were attempting to implement. Martha listened intently, her expression hardening with each detail revealed. "This cannot go on," Martha declared decisively. "I know some people who also deeply care about your mother's legacy and will be outraged to hear this. We need a plan, and we need to act fast." Martha quickly organized a meeting at her home, gathering a group of her mother's old friends, all influential in their own fields. Jack was welcomed by friendly but serious faces, understanding the gravity of the situation. One by one, they discussed how they could help. George Harrow, a lawyer experienced in high-profile litigation, offered to review the documents and look for legal loopholes. Lisa Raymond, a journalist with media connections, suggested an information campaign to bring the situation to public attention if necessary. "The first step is to protect Sophie," George stated, looking over the documents. "We need a court order to halt any changes in the management of the inheritance until all this is investigated." "I agree," Lisa added. "And in the meantime, I'll start preparing an article. If Shirley and Richard don't back down, we'll go public. They won't want the public scrutiny." With a plan in action and the support of determined allies, Jack felt a wave of relief and hope. They spent hours mapping out every detail, every step to be taken. At the end of the meeting, as the others began to disperse, Jack stayed back for a moment, thanking Martha. "I don't know how to thank all of you," he said, his gratitude sincere. "We're doing this not just for you or Sophie," Martha replied, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We're doing this for your mother and what she stood for. She would have done the same for us." Jack left Martha's house with a renewed sense of purpose. As he walked back to his car, he knew the coming days would be crucial. He was armed with a plan and the necessary support to face Shirley and Richard, but he also knew that the looming confrontation could irreversibly change the course of their lives. The days that followed were tense and filled with anticipation. Jack, with the support of his mother's allies, had devised a meticulous strategy, but he knew that the most challenging part would be to confront Richard directly. Determined to face the situation head-on, Jack arranged a meeting with Richard at one of the private clubs the magnate frequented, a place where important conversations often remained hidden behind ornate walls and heavy curtains. Richard was already waiting, seated in a leather armchair with a glass of whiskey in hand, displaying a calm that starkly contrasted with the tension in his eyes. "Jack, what a surprise," Richard began, rising with a forced smile. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Let's skip the formalities, Richard. We both know why I'm here," Jack said, his voice firm and resolute as he sat down across from him. Richard watched Jack for a moment, then slowly nodded. "I suppose you're talking about the marriage with Sophie and the arrangements we've made." "Arrangements that involve manipulation and falsified documents," Jack retorted, getting straight to the point. "Why, Richard? Why do this to Sophie? To her family?" Richard sighed, setting his glass down on the table before responding. "Jack, you don't understand the pressures that come with the territory in which people like me operate. Maintaining a status, a reputation. It's not just for vanity. It's a necessity, a way to survive in this game." "At the expense of deceiving an innocent woman? That's survival to you?" Jack asked, his disdain clear in every word. "It's not that simple," Richard began, his defensive posture softening slightly. "Yes, I've done things that aren't exactly ethical. But the world we live in, the world your sister is entering, it's a world where appearances and alliances are everything. I was trying to protect my future, our future." "Protect? Is that what you call manipulating my sister into marrying you?" Jack challenged, unable to hide his indignation. Richard looked at Jack, their eyes locked in a standoff. "It's not as black and white as you make it out to be, Jack. There are nuances here that—" "There are no nuances in lies, Richard," Jack interrupted. "You planned this from the start, used Shirley for your ends. It ends now. I'm here to say that we're taking legal action." Richard's face hardened, the reality of Jack's words hitting him fully. "You're making a big mistake, Jack. This could destroy Sophie." "The only mistake here was trusting people like you," Jack replied coldly. "Sophie will be informed of everything. She deserves the truth." Richard ran his hand through his hair, clearly shaken. "So, this is how we're going to play it. Very well. But know that I won't go down alone." Jack stood up, his resolve reinforced by the confession and Richard's veiled threats. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my family, Richard. This is more than a game to me." With those words, Jack left the club, each step echoing with the weight of his resolve. As he walked away, he knew that the next actions he would take could trigger events that would change the lives of all involved. The battle was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. After the confrontation with Richard, Jack was more determined than ever to intervene and protect Sophie from the clutches of a manipulated marriage. However, Shirley, realizing that her scheme was hanging by a thread, decided to take drastic measures to consolidate her plans before Jack could effectively act. The morning after Jack and Richard's meeting, Shirley visited Sophie at her apartment. The atmosphere was tense. Sophie appeared restless, a shadow of doubt hovering over her face since her last conversation with Jack. "Sophie, dear, we need to expedite things," Shirley began, her voice tinged with an artificial urgency. "Given the market's instability and the closing opportunities, Richard and I thought it would be best to move up the wedding. It will also strengthen our position against any attempts to destabilize our family." Sophie looked at Shirley, surprised and confused. "But Shirley, I need more time to think. Jack showed me some concerning things, and I don't know if—" Shirley interrupted, placing a comforting yet firm hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Sophie, I know Jack has his concerns, but he doesn't understand the complexities of this world like we do. You don't want the media to start speculating and creating scandals about our family, do you? We need unity and strength now, more than ever." Feeling cornered and overwhelmed, Sophie nodded slowly, still uncertain. "I suppose you're right, Shirley." Satisfied, Shirley hurried to organize everything. Within days, she had planned the wedding at a luxurious hotel, ensuring that everything happened quickly, leaving little room for intervention. She also took steps to further isolate Sophie, restricting her communications and meetings with Jack under the pretext of pre-wedding stress. Jack, for his part, was struggling to navigate the obstacles imposed by Shirley. Every attempt to speak with Sophie was blocked, every message filtered. Jack's frustration grew as he watched Shirley weave her web even more effectively. Days before the wedding, Jack finally managed to find Sophie in a rare moment away from Shirley's watchful eye. They met at the park where they used to play as children, a place that now seemed a distant remnant of a simpler life. "Sophie, you can't marry Richard." "Not like this," Jack implored, holding his sister's hands as he looked into her eyes. "The documents I saw, they clearly show his and Shirley's intentions. It's all manipulation." Sophie, tears in her eyes, shook her head. "I don't know what to do, Jack. Shirley is always one step ahead, and I feel so alone in this." Jack squeezed Sophie's hands tighter. "You're not alone. I'm here, And our mother's friends are with us too. We'll find a way to stop this. But you need to be ready to take a stand." Sophie nodded, wiping away her tears. "I will be, Jack. I will be." With renewed determination, the siblings began planning how they could disrupt the wedding and expose Shirley and Richard. Time was short and the stakes had never been higher. Jack knew the final confrontation was rapidly approaching, and they needed to be ready to face whatever came next. In the days leading up to the wedding, the atmosphere in Sophie's apartment was thick with tension and expectations. The doubts planted by Jack during their meeting in the park had taken root, making her question every smile and gesture from Richard and Shirley. Feeling increasingly like a stranger in her own life, Sophie decided to seek answers on her own. On a rainy afternoon, while Shirley was at a wedding planning meeting, Sophie seized the opportunity to explore Richard's office, a place she rarely entered. With her heart pounding, she opened drawers and rifled through documents, searching for something that could shed light on Richard and Shirley's true intentions. Then she found it, hidden in a rarely used drawer, an envelope with her name elegantly written on it. Inside was a series of printed emails between Richard and Shirley, detailing parts of their plan to control her inheritance. The words before her eyes were like knives, cutting through any illusion she still held. "This can't be true," Sophie murmured to herself, feeling the weight of betrayal crush her. Every line she read confirmed Jack's warnings. She was being manipulated, used as a pawn in a game of power and greed. At that moment, the office door abruptly opened. It was Shirley, returning early from the meeting. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" Her voice was a mix of surprise and irritation. Sophie, holding the emails with trembling hands, faced Shirley with newfound determination. "What does this mean, Shirley? Why are you and Richard doing this to me?" Shirley closed the door gently behind her, her face hardening as she approached Sophie. "Sophie, you don't understand. It's all to protect our legacy, to ensure our future. By manipulating me, lying to me, this is protection," Sophie challenged, the sadness in her eyes giving way to anger. Shirley sighed, looking momentarily weary. "Sometimes we have to make tough choices for the greater good. You'll see in time that this was for the best." Sophie shook her head in disbelief.
"No, Shirley.
"This ends now. I'm not marrying Richard. I can't trust either of you." Seeing that her words had little effect, Shirley changed tactics. "Sophie, think carefully. Are you willing to ruin everything because of a few words on paper? Think of the dishonor, the scandal this will bring to our family." Sophie, however, was resolute, strengthened by the truth she now knew. "I'd rather live in truth than under the shadow of your lies, Shirley." Leaving a stunned Shirley behind, Sophie ran to her room, grabbed her phone, and called Jack. "Jack, I found the proof. I'm not going to marry him. We need to stop this." Jack, on the other end of the line, felt a mix of relief and urgency. "I'm coming over right now, Sophie. We'll handle this together." With the evidence in hand and her alliance with Jack renewed, Sophie knew the final confrontation was near. It was time to face Richard and dismantle the plan once and for all. With a burning determination, she prepared for the next steps, knowing that the coming hours would decide the course of her life. After the revealing conversation with Sophie, Jack quickly headed to her apartment, concerned not only about the revelations but also about his sister's safety. Sophie's discovery of Shirley and Richard's plot had been a significant step, but Jack knew the real danger still lurked in the shadows surrounding Shirley. Arriving at the apartment, he found Sophie waiting, holding the emails, her face a mix of determination and fear. Without wasting any time, Jack took Sophie to a quiet cafe where they could talk without the risk of being overheard. "Sophie, this is more serious than we thought," Jack began, his eyes scanning the room to ensure their privacy. "Shirley's connections aren't just with corrupt magnates and sly lawyers. There's something more dangerous behind this." Sophie looked at Jack apprehensively. "What do you mean? What have you discovered?" Jack sighed, his expression grave. After you showed me those emails, I made some calls. A friend in the police managed to give me confidential information. Shirley is connected to people involved in much darker activities. We're talking organized criminals, Sophie. People who wouldn't hesitate to use violence to get what they want. Sophie paled, absorbing the gravity of the information. This is terrifying, Jack. What are we going to do? If Shirley is that involved, we're in danger. Jack took Sophie's hands, trying to convey some confidence. We're going to protect ourselves. And we're going to expose Shirley and Richard before they can harm us. I'm already working on a plan with our mother's friends and some of my contacts. Their conversation was interrupted when Jack's phone vibrated. It was a message from his friend in the police, containing alarming information. One of Shirley's criminal associates had been spotted near the cafe. Jack looked at Sophie urgently. We need to leave now, Sophie. It's not safe here. Quickly, he paid the bill and guided Sophie out, taking care to avoid being followed. As they drove to a safe location, a refuge only Jack knew about, he explained more about the plan. We'll need concrete evidence of all of Shirley's connections. My friend will help us get it. Once we have what we need, we'll go straight to the police and the press. We won't let Shirley get away with this. Sophie, though visibly shaken, nodded in agreement. I trust you, Jack. I just want this to be over. I want my life back. Jack drove through the streets with a mix of caution and speed, knowing that every minute was crucial. They were about to delve deeper into the web of betrayal and danger than they had ever imagined, but Jack was determined to protect his sister, no matter the cost. Arriving at the refuge, Jack and Sophie prepared for the next phase of their fight. The battle to unmask Shirley and her dangerous connections was just beginning, and Jack knew the coming steps would require all his focus and courage. In the safe haven, as the shadows of night began to fall, Jack and Sophie sat down to unravel even more of the complex web of deceit woven by Richard. Jack had obtained more information through his contacts, and what they revealed was even more sinister than they had expected. Richard didn't just manipulate documents and plan to take control of your inheritance, Sophie, Jack began, as he handed her a series of files and photos. He also has a history of intimidating and blackmailing those who oppose him. Look at this. Sophie picked up the first file, a copy of a withdrawn police complaint by a businessman who, years ago, had tried to report Richard for corrupt practices. The document detailed veiled threats and suspicious incidents, like break-ins and vandalism, that occurred after the complaint. This is terrible. How could he continue to get away with this? Sophie murmured, anger growing inside her as she flipped through the documents. He has connections, Sophie. Connections that cleared his path, removing legal obstacles and silencing opposition, Jack explained, his voice heavy with frustration and anger. Sophie read a transcript of a secretly obtained recording where Richard threatened another rival with cold, calculated words. If you continue to interfere, you'll find that my patience has limits. And believe me, you don't want to see what happens when those limits are crossed. As she put the papers aside, Sophie felt a mix of fear and disgust. I was about to marry this man. How could I have been so blind? Jack placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You were manipulated, Sophie. He and Shirley are masters at this. But now we know the truth, and it's time to act. Yes, Sophie agreed, her determination growing despite the fear. We have to expose him. No one else should suffer because of his actions. Jack nodded, his eyes resolute. I'm already organizing everything. We'll need more evidence and testimonies to build a solid case. I'm reaching out to some of his previous victims to see if they're willing to speak now. Sophie sighed, feeling a slight weight lift off her shoulders. Thank you, Jack, for everything. We're going to end this together, he replied, a brief, weary smile crossing his face. That night, as they planned their next steps, Jack's phone rang. It was one of his contacts, offering a critical piece of the puzzle. financial evidence linking Richard to much more severe criminal activities. "This is great, we'll need this," Jack said after hanging up, his voice now carrying a new layer of urgency. They knew the road ahead would be difficult and dangerous, but with each new revelation, Sophie felt more driven to fight, not just for her freedom, but for the justice that so many had been denied. Armed with the truth, they prepared for the final confrontation, determined to unmask Richard and Shirley once and for all. In the calm of the early morning, while the city slept, Jack and Sophie were more awake than ever. Sitting in the small kitchen of Jack's safe haven, surrounded by papers, computers, and several cups of coffee, they mapped out what would be the most audacious plan of their lives. "Sophie, we have to be meticulous," Jack began, pointing to the laptop screen displaying a complex diagram of their connections and action plan. "We're not just going to get out of this situation. We're going to do it in a way that Shirley and Richard can't hurt anyone else." Sophie, despite her obvious fatigue, nodded with determination, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her. "What do we need to do first?" "We're going to organize a press conference," Jack proposed, sketching out a timeline. "But first, we need to make sure all the evidence is secure and ready to be presented. I've also contacted a lawyer who specializes in fraud and corruption cases to help us structure everything legally." Sophie picked up one of the dossiers, flipping through the pages filled with transcripts and incriminating photos. "What about the journalists? How will we know who to trust?" Jack smiled, a hint of cunning crossing his tired face. "I've thought of that. We'll use trusted contacts who work for major media outlets. Additionally, I have friends in investigative journalism who will be willing to help us leak information in a controlled manner." As they planned, Jack and Sophie began compiling a list of all possible allies, including journalists, former victims of Richard and Shirley, and co-workers who might also have been manipulated. Jack had already reached out to several of them, securing their support once they came forward with the evidence. "Jack, what if they try to stop us?" Sophie asked, worry marking her voice as she contemplated the power and reach Shirley and Richard possessed. Jack placed his hand over hers, giving a reassuring squeeze. "They'll try, no doubt. But we're doing everything out in the open and with the support of the law. Plus, we'll make sure the information is so widespread that silencing it will be impossible." Reviewing every detail, they prepared document packages, each meticulously marked and organized to ensure nothing was lost or forgotten. They decided on the date and location for the press conference, choosing a public space known for its neutrality and easy access for the media. As the sky began to lighten, signaling the approach of a new day, Jack and Sophie finally allowed themselves a break, leaning back in their chairs with a mix of exhaustion and hope. The battle would be tough, but they were ready to face whatever came, armed with truth and justice on their side. "We're almost there, Sophie. The day after tomorrow, this will be in the headlines, and then we can finally breathe easy," Jack said, a tired smile lighting up his face as the sun rose, promising not just a new day, but a new beginning. The night of the gala event had finally arrived, a date marked on the calendars of the city's elite. The grand ballroom was filled with glittering chandeliers and elegantly decorated tables. New York's high society, dressed in their most sophisticated attire, murmured with anticipation, unaware they were about to witness a historic moment. Jack and Sophie, prepared and resolute, arrived together. Sophie wore an elegant blue silk dress that complemented her determined posture, while Jack opted for an impeccably tailored suit that concealed the carefully prepared documents in his inner pocket. As guests enjoyed cocktails and canapés, Jack and Sophie circulated the room, each greeting and smile hiding the nervousness they felt inside. They knew the next few hours would be decisive. As the appointed time approached, Jack signaled to the sound technician, an ally he had carefully instructed before the event. The music lowered, and an expectant silence fell over the room. Jack stepped onto the small stage set up for speeches, with Sophie by his side, facing the curious gaze of the crowd. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Jack began, his voice clearly amplified throughout the ballroom. "I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but we have something very important to reveal about certain individuals in this room." Uneasy murmurs swept through the room as all eyes turned to him. Richard, who was conversing with a group of investors, froze, his face pale. Shirley, on the other hand, tried to maintain her composure, although her eyes betrayed a flash of panic. "Sophie and I have uncovered a series of disturbing truths," Jack continued, while Sophie handed out envelopes with the evidence to the journalists present. "Among them is the fact that our mother's death was not an accident as reported." A muffled gasp was heard from a corner of the room. Jack then revealed the transcripts and emails that not only proved the manipulation of Sophie's inheritance, but also Richard's questionable connections to criminal activities and Shirley's involvement in a plan that hastened their mother's death for personal gain. Richard tried to interrupt, his voice rising in protest. "This is absurd. How can you believe these fabricated lies?" Sophie then took the floor, her voice firm. "We have all the documented evidence here. These are not just words, Richard. These are facts, checked and confirmed." The tension in the room was palpable. Guests exchanged shocked glances as they flipped through the documents detailing Richard and Shirley's actions. Reporters began broadcasting live, their cameras capturing every moment of the dramatic revelation. Finally, Shirley, realizing there was no way out, broke the silence. "Yes, I did what was necessary to protect our estate," she confessed, her voice trembling. "But I never wanted." "Your ambition cost our mother's life," Sophie interrupted, tears in her eyes shining with a mix of sadness and relief for finally confronting the truth. The police, previously alerted by Jack, arrived to take Richard and Shirley into custody. As they were led away, the ballroom remained in a state of profound shock. Jack and Sophie embraced, knowing the battle had been won, but the war against grief and the rebuilding of their lives was just beginning. After the dramatic revelation at the gala event, the empire built by Shirley and Richard began to crumble under the weight of exposed truths. The consequences of their actions, now public, reverberated through high society and the media, triggering a series of events that neither of them could stop. The morning following the exposé, Shirley's residence was surrounded by reporters and onlookers. The police, now in possession of the evidence collected by Jack and Sophie, conducted additional searches of the property, uncovering more documents and evidence that only reinforced the gravity of the crimes committed. Meanwhile, downtown, Richard's office was another scene of turmoil. Betrayed investors and confused employees gathered outside, seeking answers to the uncertainties they now faced. The police and federal agents worked to seal the building and collect more evidence, each discovery more damning than the last. Inside an improvised conference room, Jack and Sophie met with lawyers and some of their most trusted allies who had helped unravel the scheme. They reviewed the next steps, ensuring that all legal actions were being taken to prevent Shirley and Richard from escaping the consequences of their deeds. All their assets are being frozen, and the investigations may reveal even more irregularities, explained George Harrow, the lawyer who had been instrumental in the process. They will face multiple charges, from fraud to obstruction of justice. Sophie, still shaken but visibly relieved to see justice being served, asked, "What about the other people involved? Those who were manipulated by Shirley and Richard?" "We're working to ensure that everyone involved is investigated," responded Lisa Raymond, the journalist who had helped organize the press conference. "And the media coverage is helping to bring to light all those who were connected to this scheme in any way." As the meeting continued, Jack's phone rang. It was a police officer informing him that Shirley and Richard had been officially indicted and that they would be brought to trial as soon as all the evidence was formally presented. The news brought a collective sigh of relief in the room. "Finally, some peace," Sophie murmured, allowing herself a moment of rest after the turmoil of the past days. Jack put an arm around his sister, sharing the feeling of victory and the beginning of a healing process. "Now we can start to rebuild, Sophie. Rebuild everything that was damaged." With Shirley and Richard's empire in ruins and the truth restoring order, Jack and Sophie knew that the next steps would involve rebuilding and recovery, not just of their finances and reputations, but also of their personal and emotional lives. The journey would be long, but for the first time in a long time, there was a clear path forward. The weeks following the trial of Shirley and Richard were a time of deep reflection and gradual renewal for Sophie and Jack. Determined to restore the good name of the Quay family and rebuild their lives on foundations of transparency and ethics, they began a meticulous process to rectify the damage left by the storm of deceptions. Sophie took the initiative to become more actively involved with the companies and foundations her mother had established, determined to use these resources for good. With Jack often by her side, she visited offices and met with teams, personally explaining the new directions and renewed commitment to integrity. "We want to be a force for good," Sophie declared in a meeting with the leaders of the various Quay family companies. "My mother always believed in the power of corporate responsibility. We will honor her memory, not just in words, but in concrete actions." Jack, for his part, worked behind the scenes, ensuring that all business practices conformed to the highest legal and ethical standards. He also assembled a small team dedicated to reviewing all past decisions that might have been influenced by Shirley or Richard, ensuring that any irregularities were corrected. "We won't leave any stone unturned," Jack said during a contract review. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." Beyond their business initiatives, Sophie began actively promoting charitable work and scholarship programs for young people in underserved communities, seeing this as a way to turn the family's fortune into a lever for opportunity and positive change. She personally engaged with various organizations, bringing a new and authentic energy that was both a form of healing for her and a benefit to others. "This is where I feel like I'm making a difference," she shared with Jack after a visit to one of the foundation-funded projects. "This is where I feel like our mother would be proud." Together, they also worked on publishing a book that detailed not only the saga they had lived through, but also their visions and hopes for the future of corporate governance and social responsibility. The process of writing was therapeutic for both, a way to organize their thoughts and plan their next steps. One afternoon, while reviewing the final chapter of the book, Sophie looked at Jack and said, "You know, despite everything, I feel like we're finally on the right path. We're building something that will last, something real." Jack agreed, closing his laptop with a decisive gesture. "Yes, we are. And as long as we continue to act with sincerity and fight for integrity, we will be honoring not only our heritage but also creating a legacy we can be proud of." As they prepared for the book's launch and the next chapter of their lives, Sophie and Jack knew there were still challenges ahead. But armed with the truth and an unwavering commitment to their values, they were ready to face whatever came, confident that each step was taking them further from the shadows of the past and toward a brighter future. Within the cold and desolate walls of her prison cell, Shirley found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time in many years. Far from the luxury and power that once defined her existence, she was now forced to confront the reality of the consequences of her actions. Visits were rare and nights were long, providing fertile ground for reflection and, perhaps, regret. On a particularly quiet afternoon, a lawyer, Mrs. Hammond, arrived to discuss the details of her case. The conversation quickly shifted from legal aspects to more personal matters. "Shirley, have you thought about what led to all of this?" Mrs. Hammond asked, sitting across from Shirley with a neutral expression. Shirley, her hair now devoid of its usual perfect styling, looked at the lawyer with tired eyes. "I wonder if it was all worth it," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "I wanted to protect our position, to ensure our family never lost its status. But in the end, what's left? The pursuit of power can be intoxicating, Shirley, but it often leaves a trail of destruction," Mrs. Hammond replied, flipping through some papers. Shirley slowly shook her head. "I see that now. I see how I manipulated Sophie, how I betrayed so many trusts. Jack was right about everything. Recognizing where you went wrong is a start," the lawyer observed, putting the papers aside. "What do you plan to do about it?" I don't know if there's anything I can do to make things right now," Shirley said, looking through the bars at the distant courtyard. "But I'd like to try. Maybe start by helping justice understand the full extent of what we did." Mrs. Hammond quickly jotted something down in her notebook. "That could help with your sentencing, showing that you're willing to cooperate and take responsibility." As the days turned into weeks, Shirley went through a painful process of introspection. She began writing letters to Sophie, Jack, and others who had been harmed by her actions. In the letters, she tried to express her remorse, her twisted motivations, and her hope for forgiveness, even knowing that some wounds might never fully heal. Every word written was a reminder of the damage she had caused, and every response she didn't receive echoed the isolation she now faced. Shirley was learning, perhaps too late, about the price of her choices. In a surprise visit, Jack appeared. He didn't accept the letters, but he agreed to listen to what Shirley had to say. "I'm truly sorry, Jack," Shirley said to him, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me, not now, maybe never. But I want you to know that I'll do what I can to make things right." Jack listened, his face impassive and his eyes cautious. "Actions speak louder than words, Shirley. We'll see what the future holds." As Jack left, Shirley returned to her cell, pondering the long road ahead. She knew the path to redemption would be arduous and, in many cases, lonely. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to try, not for power or status, but for something much harder to reclaim, her conscience. After the emotional and legal storms that had shaken her existence, Sophie Quay finally began to feel she was taking control of her life again. With Shirley and Richard's corrupt empire dismantled, she found herself in a position to use her inheritance in a productive and positive way, honoring her mother's memory and values. On a clear spring morning, Sophie walked through the gardens of a local charity that cared for underprivileged children, a place her mother had fervently supported. The director of the institution, Mrs. Green, accompanied her, showing the facilities and discussing ongoing projects. "We're so grateful for your support, Mrs. Quay," said Mrs. Green, as she showed Sophie a new playground under construction. "Your donation will allow us to complete this outdoor area for the children just in time for summer." Sophie smiled, watching some children playing in the distance. "Please, call me Sophie. I'm just continuing the work my mother started. She loved this place, and I know how important the work you do here is." "Your support makes a real difference," Mrs. Green reiterated, before introducing Sophie to some of the staff and volunteers who shared stories of how the programs were helping to improve the children's lives. Inspired by this visit, Sophie decided she wanted to be more involved, not just by funding but also by actively participating. She began visiting the institution regularly, working with the children and bringing new ideas for programs that could expand the organization's impact. In addition to her work with the Children's Institution, Sophie started a foundation in her mother's name, dedicated to supporting the education and well-being of young women. The foundation, a tribute to her mother's passion for women's education, quickly gained recognition and began forming partnerships with schools and educational programs across the country. "We want to equip young women with the tools they need to build a better future," Sophie explained during the foundation's launch, where journalists and social influencers gathered to cover the event. "My mother deeply believed in the power of education, and it's this belief that we're carrying forward with this foundation." As Sophie spoke, the audience was visibly moved and inspired by her determination and clarity of purpose. After the event, Jack approached her, a proud smile on his face. "You're doing amazing things, Sophie," Jack said, hugging his sister. "Mother would be so proud." Sophie, strengthened by Jack's presence and the community's support, knew there were still many challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them. "Together, we'll make a difference, Jack. This is just the beginning." With new paths opening before her and the determination to make a difference in the world, Sophie was ready to lead her foundation and support other causes, leaving behind a legacy of manipulation and beginning a new chapter based on love, compassion, and real change. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sophie and Jack walked slowly through the garden of the estate that had once been the center of their family's lavish parties. Now, it was a place of tranquility, a sanctuary where they could reflect on the tumultuous events of the past months and contemplate the future. "Do you think Mom would have been proud of us?" Sophie asked, her voice soft with a mix of longing and hope. Jack, gazing at the horizon, smiled slightly. "I know she would be, Sophie. We've overcome so much, changed so much, all guided by love and truth. She always taught us that those are the most important things." Sophie stopped and looked at the garden, now filled with flowers they had planted together, each one symbolizing a step in their healing journey. "I feel like I finally understand what she meant about the true meaning of family. It's not about blood or wealth, but about support, understanding, and mutual growth." Jack nodded, picking up a handful of soil in his hands. "And love, Sophie. Don't forget love. It's what kept us together, what helped us face every challenge. It's what turned this place from a symbol of power and manipulation into a true home." The two continued to walk, reflecting on the challenges they had faced, the losses they had suffered, and the victories they had won. They discussed their future plans, not just for the foundation and family businesses, but also for their own personal lives. "You know, Jack, I've been thinking about writing a book," Sophie revealed, a spark of enthusiasm in her eyes. "Not just about our struggle, but about how we can find the strength to change, to make a difference. I want it to be a message of hope for anyone facing their own battle." Jack smiled, proud. "That would be amazing, Sophie. And I'll be here, for whatever you need. Always." As the day gave way to night, Sophie and Jack sat on a garden bench, watching the stars begin to shine in the clear sky. It was a moment of peace, a pause in the constant motion of their lives. They knew the road ahead would still have its challenges, but they also knew that, together, they could face anything. "To the future, then," Sophie said, raising an imaginary glass. "To the future," Jack echoed, their silent toast sealing a commitment to the days to come. As the night enveloped the world around them, Sophie and Jack felt strengthened by the certainty that, no matter the obstacles, they had each other, and that was more than enough. United by the past, strengthened by the present, they looked to the future with hope and determination, ready to live an authentic and loving life, a true legacy of love and transformation.
So, if you're not subscribed yet, click on the subscribe button below and join our community. Thank you for your support and see you in the next videos.